We are in an interesting time when it comes to the discourse regarding video games, Nintendo, and the damage control that the industry is now going through. The attempted downplaying of every major Nintendo game that comes out, no matter what it is, how much it sells, how good the game actually is, it always somehow, some way gets overshadowed by something else. Really, for no reason other than the fact that developers, journalists, and gamers cannot handle the fact that Nintendo is the best in the industry, right? We saw this back in 2017 with games like Breath of the Wild, the best selling game of all time, right? One of the best games ever made, being like legitimately having to compete with stuff like Horizon Zero Dawn, right? It was like a blowout from the get go, right? Zelda stomped Horizon Zero Dawn. But for the first couple of years, there was, especially like for the first couple of months, there was a big push, a big push among the community to pretend as if both games were great. They were on about the same level of quality. That Horizon was better actually because it was a new IP. That Zelda wasn't a real Zelda game because it was open world and the dungeons were bad and Horizon had a female lead. Like it was a complete joke, right? And we saw like a handful of games being propped up that way. Games like Yakuza 0, Nier Automata, Persona 5, none of which even came close to touching what Breath of the Wild did. And now in 2023, now that we have the sequel to Breath of the Wild, we're seeing the same thing happen again. The industry does not want to admit that Tears of the Kingdom is the best game released this year. They're going to go to any lengths imaginable to try and pretend that Final Fantasy 16, Street Fighter 6, Diablo 4, Baldur's Gate 3, that anything this year has a snowball's chance in hell of like beating Tears of the Kingdom from Game of the Year. Now, I think it's up in the air whether or not like Tears of the Kingdom wins absolutely, like through all these gaming news outlets or like through the Game Awards show or whatever, because I think those shows are really biased. But I think objectively speaking, like the best game released this year is Tears of the Kingdom. Bar none. It's not even close. But right now we're kind of in this weird situation where developers are doing everything they possibly can to try and smear Zelda and hype up like everything else they possibly can. Whether it's Hi-Fi Rush or Baldur's Gate 3 or Starfield coming out in a couple of weeks, like the damage control will never stop. They will never admit that Nintendo is in a league of their own and no studio in the world can even come close to what they're doing. And it's kind of led to this realization. I have kind of come to a realization over the past couple of weeks is after over the past couple of years is that like we are in like a post console war era, right? Like objectively speaking, actual gamers, people who actually like playing video games, all universally agree that yeah, the Nintendo IPs, the stuff that Nintendo makes, whether it's first or second party, Nintendo exclusive stuff, they are a cut above the rest of the industry. Like, no longer can we pretend as if, like, Final Fantasy is bigger, that Resident Evil is bigger, like the Metal Gear Solid, like the IPs that the industry used to use to weaponize against Nintendo, that have traditionally used to, like, go against Nintendo, Sonic the Hedgehog, like, basically all of them are, like, dead. Like, all of them are in the ground, they're buried, they're long forgotten, they cannot compete, right? We went into Tears of the Kingdom's release thinking that it was going to have to compete with Final Fantasy 16, right? We thought it was going to be a lot closer than it actually was, but in reality, Tears of the Kingdom is a massive, massive success, and Final Fantasy 16 is such a huge failure that nobody, like Square Enix is never going to recover from it ever. Like it's a disaster for the third parties. So what's had to happen over the past couple of years in order to try and justify the existence of third-party studios, of third-party gaming, we have had to move away from like the traditional format of like overhyping third-party exclusives, stuff like Assassin's Creed, stuff like Halo, stuff like Gears of War, stuff like Dead Space, Mass Effect, these things, right? Big AAA IPs, right? We're moving past gaming IPs, which cannot compete with Nintendo ones, and having to move on to multimedia franchises. Baldur's Gate 3, D&D, right? Suicide Squad, like that's a DC property, like Spider-Man, that's a Marvel property. There are lots of other examples of this, but typically the Barbie movie, right? That's the big movie that people are trying to put against the Super Mario Bros. Movie, right? Like, oh man, the Barbie movie might be more successful. Well, first of all, who cares? Like, both of them are in the top 20, like, highest grossing films of all time. Like, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is a huge success by any margin, and I think like the fact that it stomped The Last of Us is more than enough like value out of that film, especially since the Nintendo films have more of a like potential for franchising as opposed to Barbie does, which seems like it's going to be a one-off. Like I don't think we're going to see a sequel to Barbie, especially like not one that outperforms the original. But like with Nintendo, like the sky's the limit, right? Like more and more, it seems like the uh the establishment, the media, the competition, like it's less about video games now and more about like these established iconic brands that are older, more established, and have are westernized, stuff that came from here, stuff like Star Wars, stuff like Star Trek, like more and more when you see like top 10 lists from people like Angry Joe, like 90% of the time you're going to see Marvel on there, you're going to see Warhammer 40K, you're going to see like sports games, and sports games that have ties to like real world teams and real world real world sports, right? And what it essentially amounts to is that like Nintendo is no longer competing with games, right? They're no longer competing with like actual gaming franchises. They are competing with brands. Like they are competing with like established brands that have ties in like all sorts of different mediums, right? Like multimedia, right? They're dealing with like, they're dealing with like Warhammer 40K. They're dealing with like the tabletop RPGs. They're dealing with like the lore, like the not the terrible novels. They're dealing with like the video games. Like they're not competing against Warhammer Space Marine 2. They are competing against Warhammer 40K. Like when you're arguing against 40K, when you're arguing against Baldur's Gate 3, you're not arguing against the video games. You're arguing against like the brand that game is associated with. Like I've already had people try to tell me that like Baldur's Gate 3 is better than Tears of the Kingdom because it has more RPG elements, because it takes so many elements from D&D. But like you're not really taking into consideration that, Tears of the Kingdom is a video game, right? Like it can do more. Video games have developed past like the stale, derivative, uninspired, boring Tolkien knockoff like traditional D&D formula, right? Like that has video games have surpassed that a long time ago. D&D inspired Ultima, which inspired Dragon Quest, which inspired Final Fantasy, which in turn inspired, modern games like Persona 5, right? Like the industry has evolved past that, but that does not like invalidate the new stuff, because like the Baldur's Gate, because D&D like still continues to exist, right? That's kind of the justification we're seeing right now, is that like when you're criticizing Baldur's Gate 3, when you're talking about Baldur's Gate 3, like you're not, D&D fans are radically defending it because it's D&D, right? That is the situation we're in right now. Like you can't, like you, it's just the blind worship of these established, like long-standing franchises that Nintendo is not quite, that Nintendo simply has not been able to age out yet, right? That's kind of the problem. Always been the problem with Nintendo, is because they're such a young company comparatively. Like Donkey Kong, the original arcade game, it came out in 1991. They've barely been making video games for 40 years. Like when you compare these like older, more established companies like Disney, like the branding has had more of a chance to like resonate with all sorts of generations, and it's only recently I think that like older people are starting to become attached to Nintendo. It stopped being a weird niche thing, right? Like purely because like people in their 40s and maybe 50s have like grown up with it now, right? And actually have like an appreciation, love, and respect for these characters. And it's really difficult to write it off as being like, oh, only for kids now, right? Like it's so weird, you know. It was so weird growing up and like realizing that like I was being made fun of for liking Nintendo. Oh, that's for kids by people who love Disney animation and had nothing but respect for like that that thing, you know, that specific company. And like it really gives you some perspective as to like what's actually happening here, where it's just the hate for Nintendo, the religious hate for Nintendo. It's entirely just a thing that other companies want you to that other companies try to push onto you in order to try to make their own brand look stronger. It is remarkable how you can see people like right now, like Video Game Lover 58, who are like making comments like, "Oh, I hope Zelda loses the Game of the Year to just to annoy Harmon Smith. I hope the Barbie movie outperforms the Super Mario Bros. One. He's gonna be so mad." Like you have these people saying this like purely out of this like sheer contempt and hatred for Nintendo. Like they're not fans of like the games that they're hyping up and are trying to say are better than Nintendo. Like they just want to see Nintendo fail because their that is their identity. That's all they really care about is like seeing Nintendo fail in order to make the things they in order to make themselves like feel better about themselves because that is the only mark of maturity they have is that they rejected Nintendo, the company for children, right? Like I'm not a Nintendo fan. Oh man, I'm into Warhammer 40K. I'm hardcore. This is the darkest property there is. Like that mindset is so stupid and so idiotic that I wish more people like would call it out, right? Like, and I'm sure like this is gonna end the same way that like the console war did, where like these people are gonna fight and claw and like do everything they can to pretend as if like Zelda isn't better than Lord of the Rings, that you know the Mario movie can't like that Nintendo isn't gonna like outperform Marvel at the box office, uh, that like Nintendo's like never going to be successful like in the long run. Like even even now, you know, like now that they've won the console war and have established themselves as like the kings of video games forevermore, like even now at this stage, like people don't want to admit that it's happened, that like it's over, and that like now companies are forced to rely on like pre-existing brands in order to like get anybody to even care about them. Like we're never again going to see like new IPs like outperform the big established Nintendo ones, right? Like I think the last time that happened was like Minecraft, and that was a decade ago, right? Like everything else has to rely on some pre-existing concept or idea. You know, they have to rely on D&D, they have to rely on Batman, they have to have like Spider-Man in there, they have to like they have to have some kind of license to even come close to being relevant. And the only reason that anyone cares at all, the only reason is because of the license. It isn't because of the game, it isn't because of the developer, it isn't because of anything. When you get right down to it, the the vast majority of the audience simply wants to see Nintendo fail for no reason at all.